go. Camera's good. All right, so today is August 29th, 2022. I'm the interviewer, Kevin Yee. My mom, Lejun Zo, is present as a cameraman, and we're here with Mr. Brian Doblar as our veteran. So, can you start by telling me where and when you were born?
Yeah, I was born October 26, 1984 in St. Paul, Minnesota.
And who are your parents and what did they do?
So my dad was he's still alive, Richard Doblar. He was in the military as well, and had a career as a police officer. My mom is Gail Doblar, and she worked for 3M for 35 years.
Yeah. So, did you always know you wanted to join the military growing up?
Yep, from the moment I was born.
Yeah.
My dad served from 1980 until 2002. So when I was born in, obviously 84, I've always just known the military and the Air Force my whole life. So yeah, it's kind of what I wanted to do my whole life.
Was there like a specific moment when you knew you wanted to join the Air Force specifically?
That started at a very young age because I was really into airplanes and I loved fighter jets and things like that. So it was just kind of naturally, I always knew it was going to be the Air Force and follow what my dad did.
Yeah. So what were you doing before you joined the Air Force?
High school. I joined right out of high school. So I was working for Menards, until I actually got accepted in and left for basic.
Yeah. And what day was this?
Left for basic, February 3rd, 2004.
All right. So you enlisted, right? Yeah. How did your friends and family feel about you joining?
They were all very happy for me because they knew it was what I wanted my whole life. It was a little bit of a challenge for me to get in due to some medical reasons. So I had to go through a real long waiver process, which took several months. So when I finally got in and got accepted and was good to go and was leaving for basic training, they were all really excited for me to fulfill my lifelong dream.
Yeah. So what types of training did you have?
So primarily my training was related to like security operations, law enforcement functions. My career field kind of encompasses both physical security and law enforcement, and then some, kind of some infantry type training, with walking through a field with 13 people and in a kind of a combat formation type thing, those kinds of things, patrols, stuff like that.
Yeah. Do you remember any of your drill instructors from boot camp?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. Yep. My drill instructor was Staff Sergeant Potts was his name. He was a security forces airman, as I was going to be. Yeah. So we kind of had that a little bit of a, he kind of picked out those of us that were going into security forces as he had been. So he kind of pegged us and, obviously kind of gave us some special attention, if you will. But I do. Yeah. I remember my drill instructor well.
Do you have any memorable stories from the barracks or?
Yeah, it was basic training for me was, I was happy to be there because it was all I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. So for me, I was super excited to be there and, and interacting with people who were kind of having second thoughts on, I don't know if this was the right decision for me.
Yeah.
I didn't understand. I couldn't relate with them. It was interesting because some people thought, basic training was 6 weeks long at the time. And they're like, this is the longest thing. Like, is this ever going to end? And obviously, I couldn't unwrap obviously it will end at some point. Yeah. Right? We're going to get out of here. It's 6 weeks, isn't that long. But there's a funny story about, 2 funny stories related to kind of the interesting thing about being in a barracks with 55 other guys.
Yeah.
The first night you get there, it's late. You don't get into because our basic training is in San Antonio, Texas. Mm-hmm. So 2 flights to get to San Antonio. You get there, it's 10:30 at night. Now you have to in process, wait till you get to your actual dorms. You don't actually get to your dorm, your barracks, until 2 o'clock in the morning. And then there's more briefings, so you don't necessarily get to get any sleep. You maybe get to lay down at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. But before that, it was about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, and our drill instructor says, you guys stink, every one of you. So you have 5 minutes to shower, all of you. So you walk into the shower, and there's 8 shower heads, and there's 55 guys being herded into this shower like cattle.
Yeah.
Like, and you have literally 9 seconds to just get whatever clean and then get out.
Yeah.
But then another time, once you kind of get used to, you get into basic training, you get a few more liberties, you get a little more time. And I remember coming out of the shower one night, and there were no towels left. Somebody had taken my towel from the room. So now here I am by myself, naked.
Yeah.
Nowhere else to turn, so I got to walk through the bay soaking wet to go find a towel. So, little tricks they play on you.
Yeah. What was the hardest part about boot camp for you?
I would say the hardest part was kind of being away from my friends
Yeah.
that I left behind. There was nothing particularly difficult for me in basic training as far as the physical stuff, the running, the push-ups. That stuff wasn't that bad. I mean, it was,
Yeah.
it was what it was. The mental stuff, I mean, you're going to get yelled at. It's just kind of part of the deal, right? I mean, you go into it knowing that it's just part of the deal. It's not that difficult. So for me, I was happy to be there, but at the same time, I was missing all my friends that were still back home living their lives, and
Yeah.
the realization that you're doing this, but everybody else's life outside is going on without you just fine. It's tough to realize that life is going to go on without you regardless.
Yeah. And
so
this
that
was
tough.
summer after senior year, right?
This was, no, it actually wasn't. So because of the medical stuff that I had to get clearance through, I graduated in June of 2003,
Yeah.
and then I didn't leave until February of 2004.
Oh,
So it
okay.
took me about
Yeah.
8 months to get everything cleared and get in.
Yeah.
But everybody was starting their freshman year of college and
Yeah.
things like that, and I was missing out on that and kind of feeling that. That was probably the toughest part.
Yeah. When you were in training, were you able to stay in touch with your friends or your family?
A little bit. At the time, we had to use payphones. I've heard rumors that nowadays they can have their cell phones at night or something like that, and they can be in touch throughout basic.
Yeah.
But at the time in 2004, it was you got to use the payphone once a week, and that was if you did well in the week leading up to it, and you got 8 minutes to call as many people as you could, and you had to have a calling card. There was no other way to do it, so you had to have a calling card. If your calling card was out, you're up. That's it. That's all the communication you really get. So other than that, you could write letters, but there really wasn't a ton of time for that.
Yeah.
Getting letters in basic training was probably one of the greatest feelings you'll ever have, just because it's someone's thinking about you, someone took the time to send you something, and so that was always nice. But yeah, payphones, and that was it.
Yeah. So after boot camp, did you have any specialized training?
Not super specialized. The training that I went through was about 10 weeks long, where you learn about security operations, you learn about law enforcement, you learn about patrolling and kind of some combat tactics, things like that, but nothing super specialized.
Yeah. So when did you become fully part of the active duty Air Force?
So I graduated, I want to say what was that? Middle of May, end of May, somewhere right around there, 2004. And then because I was active duty at the time, I got orders to a base in southern New Mexico.
Yeah.
So out of training, I got orders to Holloman Air Force Base, which is about 90 miles north of El Paso, Texas, in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico. So the process of finishing training and then getting some leave to go home and spend time with family before having to report to my base.
Yeah.
So I reported to my base end of June. So I had a couple weeks, and then at the time you could go and help a recruiter, so you didn't have to use your vacation, your leave time. So I came back to here and just kind of worked with a recruiter to help recruit new airmen. And at the time, you'd get to go home at night and spend time with family and friends and things like that. So I had a couple weeks home before having to go. So that was really once you get to your first duty base, now you're out of the training environment and you're kind of fully in. So
Yeah. And what was your job in the unit you were part of?
So I had a little bit of a difference. So normally the security forces airmen that come out of school get to their base, they go through kind of some refresher training to make you aware of local stuff, things that are particular to your base. And then you go to what's called flight. And flight is where, you have a day shift, usually an afternoon shift or a mid shift, or you just have a days and mids if you're working 12-hour shifts. And you would go work the gate, you would go work the flight line, you would go work patrol, right, on the base, being the security for the base. And that usually is about a month in between where that, you kind of come in, you do your initial training, and then you get assigned a flight, you go work, and now you're just working full time. Like that's your job. But when I got to my base within the first week, we had a senior NCO, we had a master sergeant walk into our room where all of us new people were sitting and said, hey, who wants to go to Iraq? We have a deployment coming up. And me and another guy both went, we'll go.
Yeah.
And so within my first week, I was on a deployment team to Iraq. So we were, obviously there was more training that was involved in getting ready for that deployment, but I never saw flight at my duty base when I first, because I was there end of June. I was on a team by July 4th, and then we deployed. We had training then in August, and then we deployed in September. And so it was boom, 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 and I was in Iraq as of like September 30th.
Yeah.
So it was quick. So I had a little bit of a different experience. A lot of people get to work their job and then they get on a deployment, but mine was immediate.
Yeah.
Which I enjoyed, which was I liked that setup.
So at Holloman, you were just like training and getting ready for the deployment. Yeah.
Yep.
At the time, this was 2004, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, what had you been hearing about the war in Iraq?
It was still in its infancy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it had been going on for just about a year and a half at that point by the time I got there. And we originally were slated to go to a town in northern Iraq called Kirkuk, and then we were in north of Las Vegas doing our training at a desert warfare school, and our destination got changed. And so we went from going to Kirkuk, and then we ended up at Baghdad International Airport. And so we knew we were going into Baghdad. And so that was, we've been hearing a lot about, kind of the insurgency that was going on, and, kind of hearing a little bit about, what the operation was at Baghdad Airport at the time. And so it wasn't anything particular. I mean, we knew we were going to be kind of on the base, protecting our little camp, our little section of Baghdad Airport. But, I mean, other than that, we were, hearing about the suicide bombers and the car bombs and things like that going off downtown Baghdad at the time. And, it's just kind of one of those things. It's just like, that's the environment that you're going into, right?
Yeah.
They definitely didn't sugarcoat it at the time. Like, this is a real threat. It just might happen. You just never know. So.
Yeah. And so how are you transported to Baghdad?
So we flew commercial.
Yeah.
We flew commercial to Dover, Delaware. We stayed in Dover for 3 days. Those of us that were not 21, we were pretty bored. Those that were 21 had a great time. They had a blast. A friend of mine actually was from the Dover area, so he knew it, and he got to see his family and got to spend 3 days with his family, things like that. So that was good. Then we took it's called a rotator. So we took the rotator out of Dover. We went to Iceland, and then we went into Kuwait City. And when we landed in Kuwait City, we had to sit there for a couple days until they had a military cargo plane that was going to Baghdad. So we sat there, I think, for a day and a half, 2 days, sleeping in a hangar until the plane was ready, and then straight to Baghdad in a back of a C-130. So that's kind of how we got there.
Yeah. And where did you touch down in the city?
So at the airport, at Baghdad International Airport, that's where we touched down. And then, so Baghdad Airport has 2 runways. We land on the runway, we park, we get off, and now we're on our camp. Like, that's literally where we were for 6 months.
Oh, yeah.
So our tent that we were living in at the time was 300 yards from the runway. And so anytime a plane lands, you just, you hear it, and you can sometimes feel, you know what I mean? It's just, we were literally right off the runway. That was the whole camp that we were staying on, was right at the airport, because our responsibility was the airport.
Yeah.
So we were right there.
Yeah. And what were your first thoughts on like just Iraq when you got there?
It was, my first thought was it was greener than I imagined. Right,
Yeah.
there were more trees. There was a little bit more kind of greenery, or a lot of shrubs, a lot of bushes around. I was really surprised by that. You think Iraq, you think nothing but desert. You think the rolling sands, but it's not that way. Obviously, with the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, there's quite a bit of water in and around Baghdad. So it was greener than I imagined. I also remember. And in the 2 other times that I've been back to the Middle East since, nothing changes. It still stinks like hot garbage. The entire region, no matter where you're at, it has a very particular smell to it. And the heat is it's just in your face, right? Like there's just no escaping the heat of the Middle East. We got there end of September, and then we left first part of April. So we were there over the winter months, and it was, it got cold at night, but it would warm up during the day. But yeah, that's what I remember getting off the plane was, and in Kuwait too, when we got off the plane in Kuwait, this place stinks. It does. It smells like hot garbage in the middle. Yeah, everywhere you go, it just stinks.
Wow.
So.
Yeah. And what were the first few days in Iraq like?
The first few days were I felt like they were kind of exciting, right? Because it's a new experience, right?
Yeah.
You're living in a tent, right? You're kind of roughing it a little bit. And in the first few days, we're doing changeover with the security forces that are there, right?
Yeah.
And now we're trying to figure out, because we are basically hot swapping. It's an entire unit that's leaving, and then it's, a hodgepodge of people from all over, from bases all over the country, to replace them. And so it was, kind of figuring out where we're going to work, what times we're going to work, who's going to work day shift, who's going to work night shift, who's going to work the Base Defense Operations Center, right? What our responsibilities are, kind of getting a little bit of the lay of the land and trying to settle in as best you can in a tent with 8 other guys, and, kind of establishing the boundaries and things like that in the tent, and just kind of getting used to what your life is going to be like for the next 6 months. So it was exciting, right? Because we're all 19 years old, and hey, this is fun. We're in Iraq. This is what we wanted. So we're here now.
Yeah.
I remember it being exciting. It was fun initially.
Yeah. Was there anything that surprised you about being deployed?
Yeah, actually. The thing that really surprised me was how routine life was, right? And how nice it was, right?
Yeah.
Because you're sole responsible when you're deployed like that, in an environment like that, your sole responsibility is to work, right? So your life is very simple. You don't have to cook, right? All your food is provided for you. Your entertainment is provided for you. And for us, it was all centrally located right there on the camp that we were on, Camp Sather, where everything was right there. You had a gym, you had a multimedia tent, you had phones, you could go in and call home, a couple computers that you could use. You could use Skype if you had that technology, which in 2004 it wasn't there yet. So it was, you didn't get to video anybody at the time. And so deployed life, I was really surprised by how simple it was. It was just, you wake up, you do your thing, you get, ready for work. We were working 12-hour shifts at the time. You work a 12-hour shift. It's pretty simple. Go home, turn in your weapon, go eat, go screw around for a couple hours, go to bed. And it's the same thing for 180 days, right? And so it was just, life is simple. Deployed life is super simple.
Yeah. Did you guys ever leave that camp, or were you stationed there the entire time?
Yeah, we were stationed there the entire time. We got to go around to some of the other camps that were on Baghdad Airport, because the complex at the time was enormous.
Yeah.
And we had just this little center portion that was attached to the airport. It was attached to the runway. And the reason that we were in this little area was this had the passenger terminal. So anybody rotating in and out of Baghdad would have to process through this. It's like going through the ticketing counter for Baghdad for the military airlift. And so we had to secure that spot, and that was ours. That was all Air Force run at the time. Everybody else around us was Army and Marines. And we had this little camp that was right in the middle of the complex. So we got to go out to the other little camps, but never off base, like outside the wire, if you will.
Yeah.
into
Okay.
downtown Baghdad or anything like that.
Yeah. So did you ever travel off base or
Mm-mm.
no?
Nope, not in Baghdad.
Yeah.
Nope. Saudi Arabia I did on my deployment in 2008, but that wasn't combat related. That was, that was normal operations. And then my last deployment was you could go anywhere. You weren't restricted to base or anything.
Yeah. So on that first deployment, do you remember the people you were with?
Mm-hmm. I remember them very well.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Would you say that you guys are like really good friends? or-
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a core of us. We were all younger. There were 4 of us. And we were very close at the time. We got in touch with each other again in, I want to say 2014, 2015. We kind of started a group, Facebook Messenger group, and started chatting and checking in with people. Two of my friends had gotten out of the Air Force. One of them stayed active duty, and then I stayed in the National Guard. And we kind of spread out. One guy was from California, the other guy was from Dover, Delaware. One guy was in Texas, and then I was in Minnesota. So we were literally 4 corners of the country.
Yeah.
And then in 2018, I want to say 2018, I think, or 19, one of the two, we all got together in Kansas City for a weekend and reunited and had a blast. It was like, we'd see each other a week prior.
Yeah.
It was great to reconnect with those guys. So.
Yeah. Since you guys weren't always working, what would you do in your free time?
It was a lot of movies, right?
Yeah.
And there's really not much else to do, and we had to check out physical DVDs from what's called the rec tent. It was the recreation tent. They had ping pong tables there. They had pool tables there. They had a big screen TV. They had popcorn. You could buy other little treats and snacks and stuff like that. Other than that, I mean, we would walk around once it was comfortable enough during the day. So it was kind of our tradition that on our Friday, it was our last day of work. So we didn't have to go to bed right away because we'd have to get up the next morning or that night. We'd have to get up that night to go to work. So we would play a pickup game of football.
Yeah.
And so we had this big sand pit. That was bordered by all these flagpoles that had been there under the Saddam Hussein regime. And it was funny because you'd go up and down the flagpoles and you could see where the bullets had struck the flagpoles from the battle when they took over the airport.
Yeah.
But there was a big sand pit and it was a perfect spot to play football. And so the 4 of us just started screwing around playing football, and then everybody else kind of started. So it was our tradition that on our Friday after we'd get off work, we'd go play football. And that became a weekly thing. So we'd try to do that stuff. I mean, there's really, play some practical jokes on people.
Yeah.
Nothing too crazy. There wasn't much to do other than that.
Yeah.
So
What was like the stated mission of your unit there?
the stated mission was to have that area secured.
Yeah.
Right. So we were responsible for that camp. We were responsible for basically the runway. And then at Baghdad Airport, obviously there's 2 runways, the control tower's in the middle, and then there was a fire department that was between the 2 runways.
Yeah.
And so our area of responsibility was kind of that fire department area, the control tower, the runway, and then everything kind of around that area and the camp was just to make sure that it was secure. People didn't get on that weren't supposed to be on, those kinds of things.
Yeah. Were there ever any incidents with security or?
Not necessarily security. Being that close to downtown Baghdad, we did get rocketed once in a while. And there was one that was very close. So our camp was kind of right against the wall of a freeway that ran north and south along the west side of the airport complex. And this rocket had gone right over our camp and then hit about a quarter of a mile on the other side of the freeway. And so we heard it go over. That was the closest. That happened in the middle of the night. It was our night off. We were sleeping, and I just remember it sounded like a freight train going right over the top of us. And then before you know it, it detonated on the other side of the highway. And you think it's loud enough. You think that could have hit the tent next door to us. You just don't know.
Yeah.
But that natural reaction, that flinch, like when you're just about to fall asleep, and that flinch, I was on the floor. I mean, it was that right to the floor, right out of bed. That was probably the closest,
Yeah.
I would say. But I mean, rockets pretty regularly throughout the 6 months.
Yeah. And where did that rocket land specifically?
I don't know specifically. I know I was told that it was on the west side of the freeway. So we were on the east side of the highway.
Mm-hmm.
It landed in a camp just on the west side of and it was an Iraqi forces camp that it hit.
Yeah.
So.
Did it kill anyone?
I don't think so. No. Thankfully, there's a lot of open area back there on that side of the highway. So.
Did you guys ever think that you were like going to be in danger when these rockets came? Or?
Yeah, I mean it's one of those things. So when you get there, you start to get the briefings about, hey, if the sirens go off that there's a rocket incoming, they can kind of tell that sometimes. They start giving you sort of the best chances of survival in a rocket attack are this, right? And so they start talking about, don't move around, get on the ground, lay flat on the ground, because the physics of a rocket attack are it's going to impact the ground and then it's going to go into the ground, but as it detonates, all the debris and all the shrapnel are going to go up like this.
Yeah.
It won't skim flat across the ground. It goes out like this.
Yeah.
And so your best chance of survival during a rocket attack is to be flat as you can be on the ground. So that's why they say, like, when the sirens go off, when alarm red sounds, it's get on the ground, don't keep walking around, stay flat on the ground, as flat as you can, because that's your best chance of survival. And then obviously it's the sad reality is that they can hit anywhere at any time, and if it's by you, there's nothing you can do about it, right? It's just a risk, right? And so you just kind of have to accept the fact that, if one hits near you and you're not aware and you're not in it, then that's it.
Yeah.
And that's the reality.
Really? That simple?
That's it. Yep.
Yeah.
And it's you just kind of have to accept that, right? I mean, there's nothing you can do about it. You can't control it, so it's not really any sense in getting too worked up about it. So.
Do you know who was shooting the rockets? No.
Nope.
Yeah.
At the time, there was a very simple, we were getting these kind of briefs about what their tactics were, right? Because we had these eyes in the sky that would be able to pinpoint where the launch was from, and then they'd get a camera over there to see like who's running around. Well, at the time, because it was winter, right, it was cold during the night, but then it would warm up during the day, and so they developed this very simple tactic, because mortar rounds, right, they detonate, or they launch when they hit the bottom of the tube, right? So you put the projectile down the tube, it hits here, and now it goes, right? And that's how a mortar works. So what they would do is they would freeze the projectile into the tube and then go set it up in the middle of the night when it was cold. And then, as it warms up, it thaws it out, and then it drops, and poof. So they could be gone 10 hours now, and there's nobody around, and this thing is just set up, and the heat thawed it out, and boom, away it went. And so there's nobody around. So I was always told that it was tough at the time to kind of pinpoint, who was doing it, but.
Yeah.
So.
Who was the enemy, like, of U.S. forces there at the time?
At the time, so it was, it was kind of they didn't really have a name at the time, right? Because in Iraq, it was more so just kind of the leftovers of, the people who wanted the Saddam Hussein, the Ba'ath Party, that kind of regime in there. So they launched what's, basically a guerrilla warfare. So they're insurgents. It wasn't Islamic State at the time. It wasn't ISIS. It wasn't necessarily Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was more Afghanistan, right? Iraq, it was still kind of the remnants of us getting Saddam Hussein out of power, and then those people wanting to basically fight and retain whatever power they could in the region.
Yeah. On that first deployment, were there like any other threats that your unit faced, or?
Yeah, at the time it was, the insider threat, right, of like the Iraqi police were starting up at the time. So I was there for the first democratic election in Iraq, I don't remember how long, right? But I mean, they were holding the first democratic election. They had a ballot. I actually still have a ballot at home from their first Iraqi democratic election. And at the time, the threats were suicide bombers, and then it was people joining the Iraqi army with nefarious intentions. So they would join the army with the intention of getting in and then killing people from the inside. That was the real big threat at the time, was kind of the green on blue type stuff, the insider threats.
Did you ever interact with any of the locals?
We did, actually. So there were not like locals, because everybody on the camp was pretty sheltered in there.
Yeah.
But there was an interesting experience that I got to do where they had a group of interpreters that were locals that were working for U.S. forces, and they housed them in a different part of the camp. And one of the things that our chaplains would do was gather, supplies and things from the care packages that would come in, and that just would sit.
Yeah.
So we would gather all of these resources, and then we would bring them to this village where all of these interpreters live. I met a 17-year-old kid that spoke 5 languages, right? I mean, he spoke Arabic, Spanish, French, Italian, English. I mean, it was amazing. And so we got to interact with some of those families, which was a lot of fun. They were super appreciative, but they live a very different lifestyle. And they basically said, before you go into this village, you had better make sure that all your gear is strapped down, because they will come and they have thievery. I mean, they'll take your canteen, they'll take your magazines, they'll take your flashlights, take your radios, like everything. If it's not tied down to yourself, it's subject to get taken. And they saw our SUV pulling in, and it was just a mass rush of people towards our SUV that we were coming in on. And they weren't kidding. You couldn't barely get out of the SUV, because they would just swarm you and start taking, everything they could. We just open the back and say, "Here you go. Here's all this stuff." So that was really the only real interaction. I mean, from local Iraqis.
So they were like mostly pretty friendly, or?
Yeah, they were very friendly.
Yeah.
Yep, they were very friendly. Because they were obviously working for American forces, and they didn't want to live. It was in our best interest to keep them safe so that they could continue working for us. So, we housed them on the base.
Yeah. What else do you remember about, like, what you did during that time?
I remember being excruciatingly boring the majority of the time, because you sit on a gate, right, or sit on the flight line. I mean, it was, part of it is you're setting up security points, right? So you've got people kind of all over the place, and so one of the jobs is to go sit in a Humvee at the end of a runway for 12 hours, and you're just sitting there.
Whoa.
And at the time, I mean, you don't have the cell phone to keep you busy. You don't have, other things. You're literally just sitting there in the middle of the night watching nothing. I mean, it was excruciatingly boring for a majority of it. It really was.
Yeah. Did you ever, like, think about home, or?
All the time.
Yeah.
Yep, all the time. That was the part that, you just kind of, you go to that place in your mind, right?
Yeah.
To just kind of help you get through the boringness and the, sitting around doing nothing for 12 hours at a time. Just think about home and, things you're going to do when you get back.
Yeah. So when did your deployment come to an end?
April, we left the airport, I want to say like March 29th of 2005, somewhere right around there.
Yeah.
It then took 3 days to get home.
Yeah.
So
And
did you need to train like the new people to do their job? Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, so
Yep.
same.
yeah. So what was it like when you came back from that first deployment?
It was fun to be back, right? You now have this experience under your belt. You're done. You're home.
Yeah.
And obviously without the ability to online shop or anything while you're there, you come back and there's a bunch of money sitting in your checking account because you really haven't spent money in 6 months. So I just remembered having $10,000 in my checking account as a 19-year-old. I'm like, oh my God, I can do whatever I want. So yeah, it was fun to get back to having a cell phone again and being able to call friends and family whenever you wanted. At the time, the phone that they had on base, there was a delay. So I would say something, and then there would be dead air, and then you would hear yourself talk, and then the other person would respond, and there was this huge delay, and you're constantly walking all over each other. So it was fun to talk to somebody in real time.
Yeah.
Again, so it was good. And then coming home was a blast because everybody's glad to see you and want to hear about it, how it was, what it was like, stuff like that. It's fun.
And you were still active in the Air Force, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what did you go on to do after that?
So I went to work flight. So I was back in Holloman in New Mexico.
Yeah.
And so getting put on one of the shifts and pretty much doing the same thing, but just in New Mexico, right?
Yeah.
Sitting on a flight line, sitting on a gate, sitting on a patrol, doing that kind of stuff. Just a lot more freedom because then, your off time, you can kind of go do what you want to do. You'll have more than one day off at a time, and, you can go explore the area a little bit and spend some money, have fun, do the things you want to do.
Yeah. And how long were you at Holloman?
I wasn't there very long. I left so I got back from the deployment like April 1st of 2005, and then I left to come home back to the Minnesota in September of 2005 because my contract had ended. I was under a special enlistment. After 9/11, they instituted the National Call to Service Act, which allowed a 2-year enlistment as opposed to a 4 or a 6-year.
Yeah.
So I had a 2-year enlistment, and at the end of it, you couldn't just get out and go home. You either had to extend, you could re-enlist in active duty, or you had to go to the Guard or the Reserve and serve your time in the Guard or Reserve. And so I knew I was done with active duty. I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I would, and so I came back to Minnesota and joined the Guard.
Yeah. And now you were serving only part-time,
Mhm.
right? Yeah.
Yep.
So did you go back to school? Or?
I did.
Yeah.
Yep, I did. I went back right away. I started school again in the spring semester of 2006 at Inver Hills for law enforcement.
Yeah. And after 2 years of no school, was it hard to transition back? Or?
It was different just because of the experiences that I had. I was a little bit older, a little more mature, and so going to a community college with, people fresh